Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to welcome you to Manhattan Institute Book Chat with Dan Yergin. For many of you, Dan Yergin needs no introduction, but permit me to do a brief observation about who Dan is. The rest of you can use the magic Google machine to find out more about Dan's storied background. He is the vice chair of IHS Markets and an acclaimed and unequivocal expert in world energy matters and geopolitics. He's also the progenitor of Zero Week, which is, for those of you who don't know, and again, which seems unlikely, is the sort of global must-attend energy conference that takes place every year in Houston, except this year in COVID times. We're going to talk with Dan about his new book, and I love the title of the book, The New Map, Energy, Climate, and the Clash of Nations. It's a perfect title for a book in many ways. And I commend to you, if you haven't read, as you saw the invitation to this event cast, the review in the London Sunday Times of Dan's new book. I'll tell you one conclusion that the reviewer had, which I agree with. It was a very fair and generous review, but fair in the sense of understanding what Dan was up to in his book. The reviewer said it was a capacious and well-written account. I think he was correct about capaciousness and understated how well written this book is. It really is an easy read. Books that are about difficult subjects are often difficult reads. Dan's book is not. It's a terrific read. And the reviewer went on to say that, and I like this this quote, and I quote, "You may find Yergin's clear-sighted, tough-mindedness depressing." Wow, end quote. Well, exactly what was the reviewer saying that you might find depressing? We'll find out. In that regard, how we're going to find out is, let me expand very briefly on what I think Dan was doing with the title of The New Map. After a storm, if a storm changed the landscape, let's just be physical, and just destroyed the landscape that you want to navigate, it would be a useful thing if someone flew over that landscape and drew a new map for you about how to get from A to B. That's what Dan's done. The perfect storm that we've experienced and are in the middle of, frankly, is the intersection of three macro trends. And this is really the essence of Dan's book. We've had the rise and the unanticipated rise of shale, oil, and gas in America, the rise in the efficacy and the importance of wind and solar alternative energy technologies, and the third part of the triad, of course, is the rise of climate politics and government funding for the latter sources of energy. So in a perfect world, a map would reflect how you navigate that. So let me start with the first question for Dan, which is the first part of the triad in the perfect storm and the implications for, let's say, our foreseeable future. By foreseeable, I mean the futures that governments engage policies for, 10, 20 years. Governments may babble about policies for longer time periods. And I, of course, reveal my bias by using that verb. But in fact, policymaking is restricted to 10 or 20-year timeframes. In that kind of time frame, Dan, are we on the cusp of the end of oil and gas mattering in terms of world's economies and therefore the geopolitics of the world?
Thank you, Mark. Thank you for that introduction. Let me first say I'm very pleased to be on with you. I have a lot of respect for your work and that you're doing in this area as well as technology, and great respect for what the Manhattan Institute does in energy as it does in other issues. I don't think my book actually is pessimistic. I think it's optimistic. It has a lot of lively characters in it. And I think, but it was interesting, his takeaway that there are some serious questions that are there, both in energy and geopolitics, including U.S.-Chinese relations. So I think those are, important to keep in mind in the discussion. In the question, so it's really four elements as opposed to three in the picture, I think. But I would say that on shale, I think, it's been a revolution that's not fully appreciated what it's meant for the economy, for jobs, for balance of payments, for investment in over 200 billion in new factories, and for what it's meant in U.S. foreign policy, the flexibility. It's really changed the game. It's a game. It's not a national game changer. It's a global game changer.
Well, that's, as you know, it's something that I've written about before. You've captured the geopolitical implications of this in I think, an extremely important way that people need to read. In fact, I know you wrote that in the shale decade, the rise of shale, that 40% of the cumulative U.S. industrial growth was because of the shale industry. It's an industrial sector. So let's turn to the big three and geopolitics. And your map takes us across, as for those of you who haven't looked at the Amazon machine to see the chapters and the layout, takes us across the parts of the world where energy is produced and consumed. But the big three, the big kahunas, are China, Russia, and Saudi Arabia in terms of how they use energy, what they're going to do in the future. Let's start with China, because it's in the news a lot. So you wrote, and I agree, China and the United States are not decoupled. It's going to be hard to decouple them. You might weaken coupling, but you're not going to decouple. So in terms of where the world is now, especially because of COVID, and you're, by the way, as an aside, to be complimented for knowing how hard it is to write a book, to get significant inclusion of the implications of the pandemic into your map. That was a heavy lift. So given that, how does that change the velocity and character of what China does in terms of what they consume and import, and of course what they do internally with respect to their non-oil and gas policies or wind and solar policies? Is anything really changed? And if so, what? And in what kind of timeframes?
Well, I think for many people, what's changed is work. And, to many people, the office of the future will also be at home. And so I think that's a factor. But I think it's a different story. And I've seen that even, companies I know, including our own, that it's one, people in North America live in very different circumstances than people in Asia who actually do want to go to the office. But I think that, yes, I think COVID has actually added to the tensions. What I say is in a kind of incipient Cold War with China, not a decoupling, but a period of intense competition. And COVID accentuated that, the mutual accusations, really the lack of cooperation. So I think in that sense, it's actually pushed added to the problems between the two countries. In terms of where China is, China, since the Korean War, has not wanted to be dependent on foreign oil. In the Korean War, it's the US that cut off their oil. Then the Russians cut it off. Then they were self-sufficient. Now they're dependent again, and they import 75% of their oil. And I think they see that as a strategic problem. They worry about the South China Sea, the Strait of Malacca. So they have pushed for electric cars, not only for environmental reasons, and not only climate reasons, but because they're concerned about their oil imports just going through the roof. At the same time, they've pursued wind and solar. Half the wind and solar in the world is there. They play critical roles in the supply chain. But Mark, as you know, but many don't know, they're also building 3 new coal-fired plants a month.
Well, they're not only building coal plants for themselves, they're the principal constructor of hundreds of big coal plants in the whole Asian region. And for the reasons that you well understand, is that in most of the world, coal is still the cheapest way to make electricity, and most of the world is kilowatt hour deprived. But there's a feature of the China play that's interesting that you and I have talked about, and you address in your book briefly towards the end of the transition, which is that for China, of course, oil import dependence and natural gas import dependence are non-trivial. They're geopolitical threats. They're imports rather than exports. Well, China has engaged in a deliberate policy, frankly, a smart policy, to radically increase its ability to extract the energy minerals relevant to batteries, wind and solar, electric cars in their country and in Africa. And in fact, to get dominance in many of the critical minerals, not just their extraction and mining, but also in the refining, which is a business that the West has eschewed for decades because it's difficult and dirty. I mean, that shift in geopolitical dependence, it's not just that they're selling us solar panels. So I think 80% of America's solar panels are made in Asia, half of them in China. But they're refining the cobalt that we put in our batteries, this strikes me as a a non-accidental policy on China's part.
Yeah, they have what they call the new energy policy, and also the Plan 2025 to be at the forefront of new technologies. So they have very definitely set out to do that. And my previous book was called The Quest. And when I started writing that, I talked to the guy who was the head of the largest solar panel company in the world, which was in Germany. By the time I finished the book, and it took me a few years, that firm had gone bankrupt because of this Chinese manufacturing juggernaut that dominates solar. It's just a reality. But I think they're strategic in many respects. Who they're starting to import substantial energy from is the United States.
Right.
Oil and gas are part of the trade deal that President Trump negotiated with them to step it up. So so it's not just markets, but it's strategy that's behind it too. And if we're looking at the a more renewable future, China is very well positioned.
Exactly. I mean, although the feature that's interesting that you captured in your book, and the part I think that the London Times reviewer found depressing, was the realistic view that no matter how fast China expands its green vision, so how fast Europe and the United States do, that oil and gas occupy a very large place in the world energy markets. And it doesn't appear that China has a significant path to changing that with respect to oil and gas. They have domestic oil and gas, they have offshore oil and gas, but their trajectory for import dependency increases in the next decade, doesn't decrease.
Well, that's right. And of course, so part of the way they've tried to solve that is with diversification.
Right.
And at the same time that we were putting sanctions on that very controversial Nord Stream 2 pipeline that runs from Russia to Germany under the Baltic, within weeks of that, Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin had this elaborate ceremony where they pulled the switch on the Power of Siberia pipeline that's going to send lots of Russian natural gas to China. So that's part of, they look to Central Asia. Energy is part of the Belt in China program. So energy permeates a lot of their decisions given the reality of their position.
Well, in fact, you jumped into where my head was going. I love what the Russians called their pipeline. I mean, I think it's the longest pipeline in the world. And of course, it transits the Arctic, which is non-trivial, as we know, building the Alaska pipeline. But to call that pipeline the Power of Siberia, I mean,
it sends a message. It sends a message.
Not complicated message. And the diversification is certainly important to China, but that still speaks in the broad scheme of things to a massive dependency on on Russia for China, and of course a non-trivial role for Russia. It's like let's talk about Nord Stream 2. So Russia has now managed to insert itself into the Chinese equation, non-trivial point. Nord Stream 2, which was roughly, I think it exactly doubles Russia's exports of gas.
Well, it doubles the Nord Stream 1 pipeline already there.
Increases, I think, 20% or so, right? The non-trivial, 100 miles to finish this multi-billion-dollar pipeline. It's been sanctioned by Trump administration. So given the geopolitics of what's going on, and given that if Trump's reelected, he's not going to want the pipeline, leave the sanctions in. If Biden's elected, natural gas is out of favor in terms of a energy form. I think the Biden administration might admonish the Europeans to build more wind turbines and batteries. What's your guess? Does Nord Stream 2 get finished, damn the torpedoes, or not?
Right now it's this $11 billion project lies in a state of suspended animation on the bottom of the Baltic Sea.
I know.
I would have thought before the poisoning of Navalny that it probably would get done. I think that the U.S. sanctioning actually German government officials is probably not wise. And in fact, Vladimir Putin would rather welcome a split between the U.S. and Germany. And the point is, though, that if you didn't have Nord Stream 2, the Russian gas would flow to Europe anyway. It would just go through different pipelines. And by the way, Russia is also headed to be a major LNG exporter, which most people haven't focused on. So you may stop that pipeline, but Russia will continue to provide maybe 35% of Europe's gas. The big difference is LNG and the flexibility of the European pipeline system, and US LNG, but LNG from Australia, Qatar, and other countries as well, because the Europeans have flexibility. They have choices. I have a wonderful story in there from the Lithuanian energy minister saying when they set up their LNG receiving terminal, liquefied natural gas, he said, this is depoliticizing gas. He also said, it's very interesting. Once we had this up and running, for some reason, the price of Russian gas went down.
What a shock, right?
Yeah.
In fact,
market forces, competition.
Before the first shipment of LNG out of America, so the Sabine Pass happened, Gazprom was negotiating lower prices for their pipeline. I mean, obviously, the thing to do to discourage extraordinarily capital-intensive LNG terminals is to promise cheaper gas, and pipeline gas is obviously cheaper than.
Yeah. So, Mark, I have a story in the book. I don't say it's me, but it was me. I was at a conference where Putin and Merkel were speaking, and I had the opportunity to ask the first question. So I started to ask him a question about diversifying his economy, so not dependent so much on oil and gas revenues. By accident, I mentioned shale gas, and he started shouting at me like in front of 3,000 people, not comfortable experience. But what it told me, and we've heard it since then, we saw it last spring in the market battle, the oil market, the oil price war, right, that the Russians look at shale as an adjunct to U.S. foreign policy, and they also really see it as a competitor that takes market share away from them.
Well, sure. I mean, few people doubt that energy has relevance to global geopolitics and policy, but it's surprising to me, maybe it shouldn't be, how naive a lot of American policymakers, politicians, and policy wonks are to how central it is to geopolitics and policy in other countries.
Mark, that really, it hits me that when I go to other countries, when one was going to other countries, one found
you can zoom now, Dan.
I can zoom there, and I don't get air miles, but save. It's good for carbon footprint. Yeah. But what I found around the world, whether you're talking to Koreans, whether you're talking to India, where it's very clear that they regard America's new position on energy as a very important, not only economic factor, but a geostrategic factor. And in a sense, they're more, I find it's like they understand that better than many people here who kind of look in a more parochial way at it.
Well, it's kind of, that's an interesting problem. I mean, you've testified before Congress and the Senate, as have I, and so you get questions about this, and I'm not a psychologist, as you know, and neither of us are psychologists. So, but the question invariably becomes why? Why do we behave in such a naive way with respect to how other nations view the geopolitics of energy? So, I mean, to a certain extent, the reignition of tensions between Turkey and Greece are about the gas finds in the Eastern Mediterranean.
Mark, to a considerable degree, people aren't focusing on the kind of this new province, which is the Eastern Med, as they call it, Israeli gas, Greece, and everything.
It's huge.
The tension, the assertion of Turkish hegemony over this water, what do they call it, the Blue Horizon or Blue Land, is totally tied up with energy.
Yeah. Well, by the way, just as an aside, our managers want me to remind everybody that's watching that we are going to have time for Q&A. So you could submit your questions while we're talking, and we will get to your questions shortly. But let me go back to the point that you made, because I think this is very much relevant to what's going on in the Middle East, broadly speaking. And I mean this in an apolitical sense, because geopolitics tend to supersede political cycles in America in particular. They may not supersede, well, I guess over time they supersede political cycles in places like Russia and Saudi Arabia, but they're longer cycles there because they don't have the same kind of elections we have. But they tend to. So we have here, the president forged a peace accord with two Arab countries, with Israel. We have, as you know, but as many of our listeners may not know, Saudi Arabia permitting Israeli commercial overflights over their nation. I mean, this is unprecedented stuff. Is it what's going on? Well, the biggest shift in the structure of what animates tensions in the Middle East is the entrance of a new player, right? It's not the entrance of wind and solar. And I don't mean to denigrate the importance in the long run of wind and solar, but on a global scale, wind and solar is about 3% of global energy. Oil and gas are roughly 68% of global energy. It's a huge, huge part of the world economy is tied up. It will be for some time on oil and gas. Then you add a third player that's not Russia, Saudi Arabia, Middle East, but the United States. It's a very different kind of economy. No matter how caught up we are in our differences, the differences between our parties, even today, historic as they are small compared to the differences between America as a political sphere and many other countries. And here we are, this rhinoceros in the pond, sloshing the geopolitical status quo. I mean, if I had a takeaway from your book, that was the part that you were trying to have people understand, because everyone already understands that politics of wind and solar and climate are changing a lot of the realignments, but you're left with this other piece. So when you think about this and your travels talking to potentates and world leaders and your knowledge as a historian, I mean, let's do this in a simple way. On the 1 to 5 scale, it's a tsunami, which is a 5, and a 1 is a ripple. I mean, where does U.S. shale fall on the spectrum affecting geopolitics? I don't know if you heard that question.
Well, I think that it's pretty high up there. Yeah, I did. It was lost a little bit on the transmission, but the first decade of this century in energy was really dominated by the super cycle of commodities drove prices up. The second decade, which we're now moving out of, was really dominated by this disruptive technology called shale. And I don't know if I'd give it a 5, but I'd give it a certainly a 4. It's rearranged the markets, it's rearranged the psychology, it's rearranged the geopolitical arrangements. You mentioned that historic deal between the UAE, Bahrain, and Israel, which kind of got lost in the news here, but is pretty darn significant. I think part of it is saying, well, actually, there are many factors that went into it. Number one, Iran, trade, but I think also the sense that the U.S. as not being very reliant on imported energy. How long is it going to be committed to the region in the same way, and why not form a relationship between the two countries that have something to offer each other strategically, and one country can help the other with the threat of drones from Iran?
Yeah, I think it's. It is one of these things that when people are caught up with, we'll call it the emotions of politics. Biden has said he would ban fracking, not ban fracking. Other Democrats have said that. Many Republicans in many of the states are reluctant, at least in my view, watching their how they react to questions. They're reluctant supporters, not enthusiastic supporters, because of just the way the politics of this have arrived. But the facts of what the world is doing are hard to dispute, and you lay them out. And let me ask this question to sort of change directions a little bit. So there is an energy transition, which you map out, but it's a transition that's 2 parts. It's the shale piece and the non-oil and gas piece, the wind and solar piece. But you write, and this is really important, that energy transitions mean different things to different countries, especially the 2 emerging and mature markets. I think this is probably both morally and geopolitically one of the most important things for people to understand. Sort of remap out how that plays out, both in terms of what it really means and what that means to the next 2 decades of policies and geopolitics.
Yes, it really hit me. I have a chapter that says, that focuses on that. It begins by quoting the Nigerian oil minister saying, it's great that you want to have renewables and wind in Europe, but, we have a lot of poor people. We need natural gas for our economy. And it really hit me from the work we've done and I've done in India. the now famous World Health Organization, WHO, says that that the most important, the biggest environmental problem in the world today is indoor air pollution from people cooking with wood, animal waste, crop waste, and so forth. And that's a issue in a country like India where you have hundreds of millions of people doing that. And they estimate 3 million deaths a year from that. So for India, it's yes, we want wind and solar. And by the way, wind and solar, particularly solar costs, have really come down. There's a solar revolution too. But they also want to actually add a lot. They want people to get people off traditional energy and get them on commercial energy, meaning oil, but in particular natural gas. And they have a $60 billion program to expand natural gas in India. They have a very big program to get propane canisters to people so that they don't cook with wood and waste.
Right.
And so that's the energy transition they're talking about, which is saving lives, very different from the energy transition that people in the Netherlands or Germany are talking about.
I know. And this is where you doubtless know Scott Tinker at UT and the film he recently put out. And it's not a plug for a film, it's a plug for his film. But that's what he focuses on. Because when you look at the magnitude of energy demands that the world will have, if you take out the billion wealthy and you're left with 6 billion, by our standards, poor, and some in extreme poverty, as they transition in the fashion you describe, the call on oil and gas swamps the decline in oil and gas that the West will affect from using more wind, solar, and batteries.
Yeah, if you think about it, WHO says something like 2.5 to 3 billion people are cooking with this waste product.
Right.
That's between 30 and 40% of the world population. And so they, this is part of their route out of poverty. So there is obviously big debate now. It used to be about peak oil, that we're running out of oil. Now it's about what happens to peak demand. And some people think it's sooner or later for oil and gas. I think it's probably for oil, it's in the 2030s. But I think we're going to be using these products for a long time. When you look at the structure of the world economy, can you rebuild an entire industrial economy in 30 years? Maybe, but it's expensive and pretty challenging. And by the way, we don't have all the technologies we need.
Right. Well, in fact, to your point, if we take the IEA's latest forecast this year, their sustainable development forecast, it echoes your forecast that you could imagine peak oil demand in the 2030 timeframe if there's enough acceleration of all the other factors, both slower growth in the emerging economies, faster growth in electric cars, all those things. But they also put in, as you know, and as the firm you helped create puts out, is you have to then look at the supply side. So even if we assumed oil demand never went back to the 100 million barrels per day and stayed at its current 90 and change and slowly declines, because that's what you get, the supply side is declining far faster because of the capital costs of it, because of destruction of oil markets from the COVID shutdowns. So you only have to look out a year or two, not too long, when the supply-demand ratio flips on an enormous, still the biggest traded commodity in the world, and prices soar.
Well, I think, much depends upon how we come out of this COVID crisis. Do we come out with feeble economic growth because the wounds in the economy are so great? Or do we have a kind of growth spurt that just takes off, like happened after World War II, despite people predicting a depression after World War II? But in that latter case, you could see oil demand certainly going up, and the cutbacks in investment have been very substantial. So it could be quite a surprise. I think, there's a tendency to want to generalize what's going to happen when we come out of this economic dark age, or maybe now it's an economic twilight zone. But I think it's obviously premature to do that in terms of the responses. We know some things, small business is going to be, is severely damaged. But we could be surprised on the upside in terms of demand and in terms of prices. I'm not saying that oil is going to go to $100 a barrel, but certainly prices could well go up from where they are now, because these prices reflect the fact that we're still in the COVID crisis.
Well, I mean, and of course that gets to a broader point. If you're a policymaker or if you're an investor, right? If you look at, I'm sure you talk to investment funds like I do, large funds who think about macro trends, and you know despite the word being pilloried in the popular space, you know, you hedge your bets, right? You should look at both sides of an equation. So we've looked at one side of the equation: oil demand peaks, oil prices stay low. If you were doing a risk adjusted analysis, if you're a country or if you're a big fund, wouldn't you want to sort of figure out what would happen in that scenario you've mapped out, that I've written about as well? That demand sort of picks up more than you expect, supply drops a little faster than you expect because of combination of punitive policies and destruction of investable capital. I mean, it's a non-trivial outcome, and interesting for Saudi Arabia and Russia, I would think.
Yeah, I have, there are some investment funds, pension funds I've talked to in recent months who are, shall we say, opportunistic, contrarian, since everybody's going in one direction, saying, well, obviously things are going to go in the opposite direction. And, for countries like Saudi Arabia and Russia, that'd be very significant given how important, how large oil is, of course, in their economies. It would also be important for a big sector of the U.S. economy, which would benefit from that too, going back to all the investment and jobs that you had talked about.
Well, in fact, if you think about the U.S. economy, let's just not use the two wide scenarios: oil demand destroyed, oil demand drives prices back up. But the Goldilocks price, right? It goes back up to $50 a barrel, which is not a crazy number if the supply demand ratio.
$50 a barrel would be fine for U.S. shale, which is going through its second revolution now. It was interesting when the Saudis and the Russians were arrayed against each other. The Saudis wanted a higher price. The Russians seemed quite, they like $50. I mean, it's hard to believe they have consumers, elements of their economy that protest when oil prices go up. So they looked at $50. And by the way, they're thinking of it competitively. They don't want, they don't want the Permian Basin in Texas to go crazy again with investment. So for them, that $50, would be fine. But it is funny, Mark, as you're saying this, I'm thinking, every 2 or 3 years there's kind of this view about what oil prices would be. Not so long ago, it was a new normal was $100 a barrel.
Right.
Then it was $60, maybe it's $50. I mean, these are commodity markets and they fluctuate.
Yeah. Well, of course, the point of it, once you state it's a commodity market, which is by definition a cyclical market, one of the easiest things to do, and I've done this, I know you have, is when oil prices are at record lows, you predict a higher price. This is easy.
Right.
In the inverse, if it ever gets near 100, you just say, well, you know what? And I've said this before, and I don't mean this as an insult to my oil and gas friends. At $100 a barrel, morons can make money. I mean, you don't have to be very discriminating about how you drill or what you do. So that oversupplies the market.
Yeah. Well, I used to joke, the book, The Prize, has hundreds and hundreds of characters as it tells its whole oil story. And I sometimes would say, actually, there are only two characters who really matter in that book. One is named supply and one is named demand.
Exactly. And of course, what the oil guys would tell you, any commodity guy, including the mineral commodities for batteries and wind turbines, is all that matters is the price. And of course, that's determined by the two characters, supply and demand. Right. Let's turn to the money and price part, because we still have a little time before we turn to questions. This is the nub of the transition argument. The nub of the transition argument is that it's coming fast and it's cheap. I mean, it's the essence. I'm paraphrasing a lot of serious analysis that say wind and solar are taking over faster because they're so cheap. Not just that they're cheaper than they were 10 years ago, it's that they're cheaper than oil and gas. And in that construct, Europe is ahead of us in the quote transition, and they have a document you write about called the taxonomy. Now, of course, you meant, and they mean by taxonomy what the English language definition of a taxonomy is, which is a descriptive categorization and construct. It's ironic, of course, that you could think of that as a tax and spend
Oh, I hadn't thought about that. That's right. A tax economy, a shorthand for tax the economy.
Exactly. They're going to tax the economy because, as you write, the
That's
taxonomy.
really good, Mark.
Well, you can use it next time. So for 2050, the 2050 taxonomy, and you nailed it by writing, and I'll quote, the 2050 goal for Europe is breathtaking, nothing less than reshaping economic activity in everything in Europe over the next 3 decades, end quote. Then in that one sentence in your book, you nailed at least what I think is the political challenge that Europe has and we will have, because the cost of reshaping, not some things, not cars should be different, but everything. So Europe is on this path. They're trying it out. So this is sort of a guess question for you, and you can answer any way you want. But do you really think that America will follow that taxonomy and spend the kind of money that Europe is spending and the kind of tax policies and subsidies and mandates? We got some of them, but they're in and have no evidence of backing off at this point that I can see.
No, I think Europe is all in on it. Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, has said this is the most important issue for Europe, as opposed to also saying maybe the future of Europe is also an important issue for Europe, the future of the EU. But I think we'll see in the Biden climate plan, it goes partway towards that, but we do have a more balanced economy, and I don't think there's not the same consensus to support what the taxonomy, which is really, a very interventionist policy in terms of regulating businesses, regulating investment, determining that, how controlling what investors themselves can invest in. It is really, but the interesting thing is, I found a paper by a well-known European economist who's supportive of the objectives, but he did point out they don't have a clue what the cost will be.
Well, I mean, so I don't want to disagree with that economist only slightly. The EU itself has funded studies, as you know, on some of these costs, both geopolitical costs in the sense of import dependencies and economic costs of how what they'll have to subsidize. There's some. I mean, it's not. There's no land rush towards understanding this, but there's been some work on it, and it's not surprising, as you and I both know, that the costs are non-trivial. They're not just economic costs, because Europe. But here, let me frame something. And again, I know you know this. It's sort of my hobby horse is to look not at just economic costs, but like you, at the structural and geopolitical costs when you make a decision to go from a liquid and a gas to a solid energy mineral, making batteries and wind turbines and solar arrays. It's a switch from liquids and gases to solids. Where do they come from? Well, as you and I've talked about, Europe, you dig stuff up. Europe and the United States are not really eager supporters of mining. The United States has been sort of antithetical to opening new mines for some time, maybe 3 decades plus. Europe similarly. But the EU has done something simultaneously. They, on one hand, told the banks there, that they can no longer provide low-cost loans to drilling for oil or gas or digging up coal. Okay, taking away their cheap capital. Simultaneously, but in a different directorate, they're talking about providing subsidies to reopen European mines that have been closed for years to mine nickel, copper, cobalt. Never mind rare earths, which aren't rare. Just these machines all require epic quantities of minerals like nickel, copper, cobalt, iron, steel, at levels that are unprecedented. Europe's not stupid. I mean, they may have different opinions than us. People aren't stupid. They know they don't mine them. So now I guess I'll put the question this way. Do you think this kind of schizophrenic attitude that digging stuff out of the earth can sustain? I mean, you can't dig out oil and gas, but you can dig out other stuff.
I think, Mark, there's a disconnect. I mean, you've done some of the most important work actually on what this means in terms of supply chains. We have a big study, as you know, called the New Supply Chains for Zero Carbon. I did notice a new report from the EU, which looked to me like perhaps they've been reading the work of Mark P. Mills, where they've kind of woken up to, oh my gosh, they don't say that we have a high dependence on China, but they say we have a high dependence on some unnamed country for all of these things, plus the mining question. So I don't think the pieces have been put together because, I've seen this at other times that companies will look at what they're doing in their supply chain, but no, they don't aggregate. Nobody aggregates what it all adds up to,
Right.
except people like Mark P. Mills, who note that actually it adds up to a lot of stuff, that the mines are not there, the supplies are not there. But if you're going to do all of this, you're going to need these what are called raw materials or minerals in order to do it.
Well, I appreciate the shout out. So your next book will be called The Hard Prize, about the mining of hard minerals in the shifting geopolitics. Because
there's no question, Mark, that's one of the things that's left out and goes back to what we talked about. There's a big geopolitical component to this too that just has not been focused on. I tried to highlight it and talk about what I say, that we're going to move into this era of big shovels, and that there's a lot of geopolitical issues that are there, but they haven't been connected with these objectives that are out there.
Although I would hazard a guess, Chinese and the Russians have connected it. One of the biggest nickel mines in the world is also in Siberia, not just the gas.
Yeah.
And nickel demand soars in a more electrified world, as does copper demand, and as does, in fact, most minerals and metals demands go up.
Well, that's very interesting, Mark, because that suggests that actually, there's another side to this where, although Russia gets 50% of its money now for its budget from oil and gas, it will be an important supplier of minerals to this.
They're unreluctant to mine, as you know, and their resources. I mean, it's the largest country in the world. Its geophysics in terms of minerals is like Canada, but bigger, and has these spectacular reserves of all kinds of metals and minerals. No, I don't have any doubt that they know how this plays out. But I think the part that's missing, and which the UN has written about, is we'll call it a gold rush to chase these minerals in more fragile geopolitical environments, more fragile countries in terms of their rule of law to protect their own environment, and in places where there's never been development, because many of these resources are the mines are. I like mining. I worked in a mining company as a young man. I think mining is wonderful, but it's a very challenging environment in which to be cautious about your negative impacts. It really does take Western skills and technology to do it. They're largely absent in the Congo and some parts of South America. That feature is in our geopolitics. That's why people worry about supply chains. That's why Elon Musk cut a deal to get ethically sourced cobalt, knowing that kids are mining cobalt in Congo, where half of the world's cobalt comes from. Somehow this is got to infuse.
Right, and the ESG focus that's been on oil and gas and conventional energy will also turn to, I think, the supply chains for the net zero carbon economy of 2050 that Europe is aiming for, and at least the Biden campaign document is aiming for as well.
Well, so let me throw out a factoid that will be relevant to the net zero argument. And this is something I've also talked about earlier. The call on global mining is going to be epic. It already is. It's going to get even bigger when we go from 3% of world energy from wind and solar to, let's say, I don't know, pick a number, 30%. Not going to be 100%, but it could be a lot. This is it's a tenfold increase in its share, which in absolute terms is probably a 20-fold increase in the supply, which in mineral terms is probably a 200 to 300-fold increase in net tons of stuff taken out of the earth. This is an epic increase in the physical mining of stuff. The global mining industry uses as much oil as the global aviation did in January 1st, 2020. It's a big oil consumer because the big shovels you write about are diesel burning shovels. So we're going to double that or triple that unavoidably because they're not going to run them on gerbils and unobtainium. That fits in the same sort of magical thinking that is totally absent, by the way, from your book. You don't engage in magical thinking. But I think, to come back to where I started, that's what the Times reviewer found, quote, depressing, that you're a realist. I think your book is very optimistic. You're optimistic about the geopolitics, that we might work a lot of it out. You're not a Pollyanna. You're optimistic that we have the resources to pursue more wind and solar, be more oil and gas. America can survive this carnage. This is more of a personal question. So when you see people review your book like that, somehow you should be you're a pessimist. You're not sufficiently on board the transition happening overnight. I mean, this is both a political and a personal question. I mean, what do you say to people when they tell you that you're not enough on board?
When the review you mentioned describes a book as, quote, "I'm just reporting a wonderful book," you say, "Thank you very much." What I've noticed is some of the reviews only review 1/6 of the book, and really turn in this environment.
I'm sort of Daniel's frozen. I don't know if we've lost the connection.
I'm back, I think.
There we go. Well,
yeah. So no, I was just saying that
vicissitudes of supply chains that are invisible, called the global World Wide Web.
Yes, I have to go find out where the router is in this building.
Well, maybe the Chinese are hacking your router because they don't like what you're saying, or the Russians.
Yeah, they're listening in.
I hope so.
Yeah, they'll find it informative.
Let me apologize my leaning into the camera. I got to read some questions here. Let's turn to some of the questions that people have, if I might. We have, let's see here. So we have some people asking some questions about the two big discussions about hydrogen and about nuclear. So we've been talking about nuclear more lately because of the move to shut down nukes, and hydrogen has now become the alternative fuel du jour. So let's deal with them briefly, separately.
Well,
you're a nuclear bull, but they're long cycle things. What say you about the nuclear future?
Well, I think nuclear in the United States is, we're not going to build any new conventional new nuclear power plants. They are in other parts of the world, like China. What I found very interesting in going to the optimistic side, and this characteristic of the United States, is that there are 62 projects and companies in the United States working on advanced nuclear potential. I mean, so it's the kind of next generation or the next generation after that in nuclear. Hydrogen, well, you'll remember 12 or 14 years ago, there was a hydrogen highway that went nowhere. If you'd said hydrogen 4 years ago, it would have been something that people would have, said, what are you talking about? But I think, given what you talked about, Europe, the pressures on companies and so forth, looking, how do you participate? Looking to hydrogen for heating, for power. So, it is a big focus now for a lot of industrial companies, a lot of oil and gas companies, saying, kind of, how do we play in this new political environment that's coming?
Sure. So I'll go on record, and I'd be happy. I'm not going to bet you. I'll take a bet with the hydrogen bulls that this bubble will pass quickly, because hydrogen is except for rocket ships, a terrible fuel to push into society at large until we find a magic new material to store it in solid form, which the chemists might come up with in the future. But it's a bubble that will pass quickly because it's so difficult to store, transport, and keep safe. But that's just me. I am, like you, extraordinarily enthusiastic about the small nuclear reactors and the development there in America. Let's turn to another question. Someone is asking about the potential for technology to accelerate the cost efficacy of shale oil and gas, not just the technology progress in wind and solar, but how much does that play into your thinking? And it looks to me like we have, go back to our masters and commanders here. I think your feed is frozen here again, Dan. Hang on.
There I am.
There you are. Did you hear my question? Was about new technology impacting, along with some price recovery, oil and gas production in the U.S. shale fields.
Well, I think that the U.S. shale is, the U.S. reached a high point of 13 million barrels a day in February. Now, I think at the end of the year, it'll be around 10 or 10.5 million. That's total, and a big part of that is shale. I think we'll start to see U.S. shale recovery in about a year from now would be a reasonable expectation. I think it will be with a new social contract where investors are getting their money back, and the growth will be much more modest than we've had before, but remains a major factor.
A social contract to get your money back. What a novel idea, I think.
Yeah.
So this
understanding that you actually do get your money back.
No, I know.
Not a hobby.
It's, well, there's like a lot of projects, the finance feature of how money is treated and what preferences you get for your investments affect things. I mean, clearly how the government treats wind and solar capital has a huge bias in terms of the construction. Whether you get your money back or not is determined by the artifice of the policies.
Well, Mark, there was an article in one of our major newspapers yesterday about the great advances in batteries, electric cars, and so forth. In the course of it, it did mention that, oh, by the way, they do depend on subsidies, but it was like in the 27th paragraph of the story.
Yeah, I mean, like you, I'm a realist about subsidies. Governments engage in subsidies that are direct and indirect all over the world and always have. So the debate really isn't, are there subsidies or not? Subsidies are inherent in tax policy, but the magnitude of the subsidies, that is what really matters. Are you essentially covering 5% of the marginal cost of doing something, or 30%? I mean, that's clearly a very different thing. And how long do you do it? And how much money do you spend on it? But there's another question about nuclear power. And we'll find out here. I think we have a few more minutes.
Yeah, I just want to warn you that although I charged my computer completely before we started, I might be signed off in about 3 or 4 minutes. So just
I think we're about 3 or 4 minutes away from wrapping up anyway. So if we go blank before I thank you, I'll thank you in absentia.
Okay. Thank you.
So the nuclear question is an interesting one for geopolitical reasons, because nukes are long cycle projects. As you begin to invest in them, invest in the infrastructure. If we don't, others will. China is on the traditional light water reactors. I guess the way I would phrase it, this wasn't the questioner's question, I would phrase it this way. For the United States to recapture geopolitical power behind nuclear energy, it would be to support, frankly, subsidize the emergence of a profoundly better, cheaper, faster to build small reactors. If we own that IP, so to speak, it would be, I think, very geopolitically significant, because countries want to diversify their security.
Yeah. So one of the things that people don't recognize, the Department of Energy spends $6.5 billion currently under this administration on basic research in science and technology. And I think that's where the answers, we don't have the technologies we need to achieve those goals that are out there. And that's where the emphasis should be, because, as you say, that will make the difference. But those things don't happen in 2 years. It isn't software. They unfold over 10 or 20 years. Well, but that's where the future is.
You're ending. This ends us on a perfect note. I mean, we're fully aligned in our thinking in this regard, and it's, I think, insufficient attention paid to that central fact: the inertial timeline in changing hardware-centric energy systems. And Bill Gates has said this, as you know, it's very long. There are long cycles, not just the R&D side, but the development side. Doesn't mean we shouldn't start to tackle them, but we should be serious about what we're tackling. And we're not being serious about the basic science side of it and engineering side of it. And that distresses me. It's an area where I think the world could actually cooperate, because the manifestation of the technology, the new magic technology, is more directly a matter of industrial policy. But the finding it, you could collaborate. This is a source of potential collaboration. So Dan, that's a great place to end up. It sort of brings us full circle to your optimism, which I share, to your realism, which I share. It's wonderful to have you join us. I'm delighted to see the book is doing well on Amazon. I encourage everybody to go to the magic Amazon machine or any bookseller you like, and if there are any others left, buy the book. It really is, and I'm not saying this just to prop up your book. I read a lot, and as you know, I write. You are a rare, fluid writer. It's an easy read. People should read this book. So thank you for joining us, and thank you for your wisdom, Dan, and thank you for all your work for the industry.
Well, thank you, and thank you, Mark, and certainly thank you to the Manhattan Institute.
And I'll wrap up by urging people that haven't subscribed to the Manhattan Institute's newsletters. There are links posted, I think, at the end of this. I'm biased. Manhattan Institute does good work. They have terrific scholars. The newsletters are interesting. It will give you, even if you're not leaning slightly right where the scholars are, I think you'll find a lot of good information and ammunition. So Dan, good hunting, good selling. We'll see you around we both live in Washington. We'll see you around town when they let us come out of our hidey holes. Take care.
Thank you very much. And thank you, everybody.